Welcome to History in Ashes, where we walk with you through the footprints of the past, one careful step at a time, so that the smoke of forgotten events can rise again. You are standing on the edge of a hillside in the year 1575, and the smell of gunpowder is thick in the damp air. A single musket shot echoes over the low valley, but you do not flinch because hundreds more follow in a steady rhythm. You can see the dark line of Oda Nobunaga's men holding their ground, their matchlocks glowing faintly in the grey rain light. Below you, the Takeda cavalry is charging hard, their horses kicking up the wet earth, and their riders bent low under the drizzle. It is not the kind of charge that pauses for thought, and yet today they will be stopped, not by walls or pikes, but by the timed fire of an army that has learned a new trick from faraway Portuguese traders. Somewhere in that chaos history is bending in silence because a battlefield like this will decide how Japan moves forward. Before we go any further, could you do me a small favor? Slip down into the comments and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is right now. I promise I am curious in the same way you might be curious about how rice farmers in the 16th century kept their straw sandals from rotting in the rain. And while you are there, go ahead and subscribe because otherwise you might miss the rest of the story, and then you would be like a lone samurai without a lord, wandering endlessly through recommended videos without ever finding your way. Back here. Now step back from the hillside and think about how a moment like this is never born in isolation. The clash you just witnessed is the product of centuries of slow, almost tedious change, the kind that rarely makes it into the romantic paintings. People had to learn how to grow more than they could eat, so that others could afford to make weapons. Villages had to form and reform around fishing grounds or fertile valleys. Trade winds had to carry not just goods, but ideas into the islands. Even the rain itself in this valley has been part of the story, because climate has shaped the pace of war here as much as ambition has. If you trace the threads of this day back far enough, they stretch to a time when the people on these islands had no samurai, no swords, and no warlords to pledge loyalty to. The earliest known inhabitants of Japan lived thousands of years before this battle, their lives marked by fishing in cold rivers, carving tools from bone and shaping pottery whose patterns look like the impressions of rope. The soil beneath this battlefield has their fingerprints buried deep, though they never knew metal or gunpowder. And yet without them there would be no roads, no trade, no kings or shoguns, only unbroken forest and waves. But how did a quiet chain of islands in the Pacific become a place where disciplined gunfire could shatter the charge of proud cavalry? How did it go from scattered coastal settlements to a land ruled by courts and clans and bound by a sense of shared identity? To understand that, you have to look at the way small details pile up over centuries until they are too heavy to ignore. A new kind of rice that could be grown in cooler climates. A fishing technique that made villages more stable. The arrival of iron tools from across the sea. Each one a step that you might overlook if you only look for the loud moments. Standing in the smoke of the battlefield, you can almost hear the echoes of those early choices. The farmers who dug canals to bring water to their fields. The traders who learned to read the clouds for storms so their boats would survive the crossing. The storytellers who kept names alive long enough for a leader to claim descent from them and say that his right to rule was born in the age of gods. None of them imagined they were part of something larger, but they were. And that is the strange truth about history. It is rarely shaped by those who think they are shaping it. If you keep your gaze on the Takeda cavalry retreating down the muddy slope, you might not see the long shadow cast by this day. But if you turn your thoughts to the pottery shards buried beneath the hill, or the faint remains of a forgotten footpath that once connected two rice paddies, you will start to see how the real structure of Japan was built. It is not the battle that makes the nation. It is the patient, slow work that comes before and after. And that work began long before there were written records to tell us who did it or why. So when you watch the matchlocks fire again and again in the rain, you are not just watching a moment of military innovation. You are looking at the latest link in a chain of adaptation and survival that began when the first people here decided that these islands could be home. What you cannot yet see is that this same chain will stretch on through peace and war, through isolation and opening, through famine and feast, until it reaches the Japan you know today. But if a story begins with a battle, where should it turn next? Should we go back to the earliest footprints left in the volcanic soil, or stay a while longer among the muskets and the rain to understand why this day felt different from all the others? If you step away from the gunpowder and the sound of hooves pounding through the mud, and you let centuries peel away one by one, you will find yourself standing on a rocky shoreline in a world without steel or writing or even the thought of a unified Japan. The air smells of salt and damp earth. The only tools you see are shaped from stone bone or antler. A small group of people are working quietly at the water's edge, cleaning fish with slow, deliberate strokes of a blade chipped from obsidian. The year could be 10,000 years before the birth of Christ, but here that number means nothing. The seasons are the only calendar that matters, and the tide is the only clock. You are among the Jomon people, whose presence on these islands stretches back further than most of the civilizations you may have heard of. Their pottery is some of the oldest ever discovered anywhere in the world. Deep reddish clay vessels with rims twisted into rope-like patterns pressed by hand before the clay was hardened by fire. These designs are not decoration in the modern sense. They are fingerprints of habit and tradition. They speak of a people who have enough stability to care about how their work looks, not just how it functions. But life here is not a frozen museum scene. It is about survival in a landscape that can be both generous and cruel. In the warmer months, fish are abundant in the rivers and bays. Nuts and berries can be gathered from the forest. In colder times, the Jomon build semi-subterranean homes, roofed with thatch and insulated with packed earth to keep the wind from stripping away their warmth. They wear clothes stitched from animal skins and woven plant fibers. Every detail of daily life is shaped by the cycle of the seasons and the need to store enough food to make it through the winter. What is striking is how little rush there is to dominate or expand. Unlike the image of later Japan, where warlords measure their power in territory, and men, the Jomon, measure their success in whether the next generation has enough to eat and the tools to do the same. They trade with distant groups, not for conquest, but for materials they cannot find locally. A shell bead might travel from the southern islands to the northernmost reaches of Hokkaido, passing through hands that never see the source. It is tempting to think of them as isolated, but the truth is more complex. The seas are not barriers here, they are roads. The Jomon learn to read the water, the wind, and the flight of seabirds, to find fish, and to navigate from island to island. This quiet movement of people and goods will later become one of the lifelines that ties the islands together, even when political unity is centuries away. Still, even in this seemingly timeless rhythm, there are changes. Slowly, the forests shift. The climate cools and warms in long arcs that force people to adapt. Hunting tools evolve. Pottery designs change. Settlements grow in size. These are not dramatic moments you can point to like the clash of armies, but they are the bones of history. Without them, there would be no stage for the later dramas to play out. Standing among the Jomon, you can almost hear the hum of continuity, the crackle of a cooking fire, the scrape of a stone tool being sharpened, the rhythmic splash of a net pulled from the water. Every action is part of a web of habit passed down without writing, yet held in memory with a precision that keeps communities alive for thousands of years. When you realize that the Jomon way of life will last longer than any dynasty or shogunate that comes after you, begin to understand how much of history happens quietly far from the moments we call turning points. And yet eventually the quiet will be broken. New people will arrive from across the sea, bringing skills and ideas that will change these islands in ways the Jomon cannot yet imagine. But before they come, what exactly was it about this way of life that allowed it to endure so long? Was it the adaptability to climate shifts, the balance between gathering and hunting, or simply the fact that survival never became tangled with conquest? If you stand long enough among the Jomon, you will eventually notice a change in the air, a shift that does not come from the tide or the season. The pottery begins to look different. The tools are sharper, thinner, more uniform. The fields you once saw scattered with wild plants begin to look organized, neat rows of something green and deliberate. These are the first signs of the Yayoi people arriving from across the water, perhaps from the Korean peninsula, bringing with them the seed of a transformation so deep that the land itself will change to accommodate it. The Yayoi bring wet rice agriculture, and with it, a need for settled communities that cannot move with the seasons. Unlike the Jomon, who could pack their belongings and follow the food, the rice fields demand permanence. They demand the carving of irrigation channels, the leveling of plots, the building of storehouses to protect the harvest. This permanence has an unexpected consequence. It creates surplus. For the first time, people here can grow more food than they need immediately. And surplus is the quiet foundation of hierarchy. It is not long before some fields are better than others. Some families store more rice than their neighbors, and the seeds of inequality begin to take root. In the Jomon world, status may have been measured in skill or wisdom, but now it begins to be measured in land and in what that land can produce. The leaders of these new Yayoi villages are not just decision makers, they are gatekeepers of resources. This subtle shift will eventually make possible the complex webs of loyalty, taxation, and governance that define later Japanese history. The Yayoi also bring new materials, bronze for tools and weapons, iron for plows and blades. These metals cut deeper and last longer than stone ever could, and they allow for both more productive farming and more effective warfare. Alongside the metals come new styles of pottery, plainer and more functional than the ornate rope-patterned vessels of the Jomon, but perfect for storing grain. Even the houses change. Raised floor structures appear to keep food safe from dampness and pests. You might think that such changes would sweep the Jomon way away entirely, but the reality is more layered. For centuries, Jomon and Yayoi cultures overlap, trading, borrowing, and adapting. Some Jomon groups adopt rice farming. Others hold on to hunting and gathering in less fertile areas. The edges of these two worlds blur, and in that blur, something new takes shape. A cultural blend that will become the seedbed of the Japanese identity. Rice itself becomes more than just food. It is a measure of wealth, a religious offering, a unit of taxation, a gift to seal alliances. In a sense, it becomes time itself, because the rhythm of planting and harvesting will dictate the pace of life, more than the turning of the seasons ever did before. From now on, war, famine, or peace will be felt first and most sharply in the fields. It is worth pausing to imagine the daily work of a Yayoi farmer bent over in a flooded paddy in the heat of summer. The sun reflects off the water into your eyes, and your feet sink into the mud with every step. You plant each seedling carefully because each one holds a fraction of your survival. The same hands that plant will later harvest, then build the levees, then repair the storehouse. And if your leader calls on you for labor or for battle, you go, because the land that feeds you is not entirely your own. By the time the Yayoi period reaches its height, society on these islands is no longer a loose collection of self-sufficient communities. Small political units begin to emerge, each with its own leader and its own territory. These leaders are not yet kings in the later sense, but they hold the power to decide who eats well and who struggles. And once power becomes visible, it inevitably becomes contested. Still, the transformation is incomplete. The islands remain divided by geography, by dialect, by tradition. The sense of one Japan is not yet born, but the tools are now in place. Surplus agriculture, metallurgy, organized labor, social hierarchy. It is only a matter of time before someone tries to weave these threads into something larger. And that leads to the question, in a land now tied together by rice and ruled in pockets of power, who will be the first to try to claim authority over it all, and by what right will they say it is theirs? The world of rice paddies and small fortified villages does not remain scattered forever. By the 3rd century after Christ, there are whispers of a place to the south where power is gathering like storm clouds. Travelers and traders speak of a land ruled by a single court whose leaders wear elaborate clothing, speak through intermediaries, and claim a lineage older than memory. This is the Yamato, and though its reach is not yet over all the islands, its shadow is already falling far beyond its valleys. The Yamato heartland lies in what is now the Nara basin, a fertile plain surrounded by gentle hills that can be both defended and cultivated. Here, leaders rise, who understand that power is not just about having more rice or sharper weapons. It is about shaping belief. The Yamato rulers begin to link themselves to the divine, weaving their ancestry into the myths of the sun goddess Amaterasu. By claiming descent from a deity, they transform authority from something earned to something inherent. It is no longer simply that they lead, it is that they must lead. This divine claim is reinforced with ceremony and with imported ideas. From the Korean peninsula and from China come new forms of writing, new political structures, and new religious concepts. The Yamato court absorbs them selectively, shaping them to fit its needs. Writing allows for more than just recording harvests. It allows for the codification of laws and the formal recognition of rank. Buddhism arrives bringing not only spiritual teachings but also monumental architecture and a model for centralized organization that will leave deep marks on the political landscape. But this is still an age of persuasion more than conquest. The Yamato court does not yet command the unquestioning obedience of every region. Instead, it builds networks of alliances with local leaders through marriage gifts and the promise of shared prestige. The exchange is simple: pledge, loyalty, and receive recognition, along with a portion of the court's growing cultural and economic power. Those who resist risk isolation or military pressure. But the Yamato's strength lies as much in its ability to integrate as to dominate. The court itself becomes a center of careful ritual. Every gesture, every offering, every audience with the ruler is wrapped in layers of meaning. These ceremonies are not merely for show, they are tools to remind all who attend that the Yamato ruler stands apart from ordinary humanity. Even the palace layout reinforces this idea, with spaces arranged to control access and movement. To see the ruler as a privilege to speak is rarer still. Outside the court, life continues for most people much as it did in the Yayoi period. Fields are planted and harvested, storehouses filled, tools repaired. But now these labors are tied to something larger. Taxes are collected not just in rice but in cloth weapons or labor. Armies are raised from the rural population to defend the court's interests or to push its influence further into resistant regions. Roads begin to appear not as neutral paths, but as arteries of political and economic control linking the core to the periphery. Religion also shifts under Yamato influence. The local kami spirits tied to places and natural forces are not erased, but rather folded into a broader system that reinforces the ruler's divine descent. Shrines and temples multiply, each one another thread in the web, binding people to the court. The fusion of belief and governance becomes a hallmark of this early centralized power and will persist in different forms for centuries to come. Yet beneath the layers of ritual and divine claim, the reality is still fragile. The Yamato court's influence thins the farther it stretches. Local leaders continue to hold real power in their territories, and alliances can shift with the seasons. The idea of a unified Japan is still more ambition than fact. But ambition has a way of creating its own reality when repeated often enough, and backed with the slow pressure of administration, trade, and belief. If you stand in the court's audience hall surrounded by carved pillars and the scent of incense, you might believe this is the inevitable shape of the island's future. But step outside into the hills and the villages beyond, and you will see another truth, that unifying a land is far easier in ceremony than in daily life. Which raises the question, will this divine claim and network of alliances hold when the court's authority is tested by both internal rivalries and the pull of distant foreign powers? If you remain in the Yamato basin and let the years pass like the slow turning of a water wheel, The wooden halls around you will grow larger, more complex, and more permanent. By the 8th century after Christ, the capital is no longer just a court, but a city Nara built with the deliberate intent to project order and stability. Modeled in part on the great Chinese capital of Chang'an, it is laid out in a precise grid, with wide avenues leading to a palace complex at its heart. Nara is more than a seat of power. It is the embodiment of a new kind of governance, one that sees itself not just as a court of influence, but as the head of a state. Here, the rulers and their advisors begin to put their authority into writing. The Richerio system, drawn from Chinese legal and administrative codes, takes shape. It divides the land into provinces and districts, assigns responsibilities to officials, and sets rules for taxation, military service, and criminal punishment. For the first time, the expectations of ruler and subject are defined not only by tradition but by codified law. This formal structure does not erase the influence of the past. The emperor's divine descent remains a core part of legitimacy, and religious life is woven tightly into the fabric of governance. Buddhism, introduced in earlier centuries, now flourishes under state sponsorship. Great temples rise in and around Nara, their roofs sweeping upward as if to lift prayers toward the sky. The most striking of these is the Todaiji, home to a giant bronze Buddha whose construction drains resources, but also cements the connection between religion and imperial authority. The creation of such monuments is not just about devotion. They serve as statements of stability, wealth, and reach. To send laborers from distant provinces to work on a single project is to demonstrate control over both people and resources. To invite artisans from the continent to contribute is to show that the court can attract and direct talent from far beyond its borders. But the machinery of the state requires constant maintenance. Census records must be kept and updated. Taxes must be collected in rice cloth and other goods, then redistributed to support the court temples and military. Roads must be repaired to move officials, messages, and troops. Every regulation written into the codes must be enforced, and every deviation recorded and addressed. It is a system that aspires to precision, but depends on the cooperation of local leaders, whose loyalty can be as practical as it is principled. For the common person, life in the Nara period might not look drastically different from life in earlier centuries. You still rise with the sun, tend to your fields, fish your rivers, and repair your home before winter. But you are now counted, measured, and taxed in a way that ties your labor directly to the central government. The rice you plant in your village will help feed the capital's officials, or the workers raising a temple roof. Your name may appear in a registry hundreds of miles away, written by a scribe you will never meet. The state's embrace of Buddhism also begins to influence daily life. Monks travel between provinces, bringing not just religious teachings but literacy and knowledge of medicine, architecture, and calendar making. Shrines to the kami continue to stand, but the landscape now includes the distant chime of temple bells and the glint of bronze statues in morning light. Still, the Nara experiment with centralization reveals its own limits. Maintaining a sprawling bureaucracy is costly and difficult, especially in a land divided by mountains, forests, and islands. Corruption and inefficiency creep in at the edges. Local aristocrats grow wealthy and influential, sometimes bending the law to suit themselves. The emperor's court remains the symbolic heart of the nation, but its ability to directly control distant provinces begins to fray. Yet even as the machinery strains, the idea of Japan as a single political and cultural entity grows stronger. A person in the far north may never see Nara, but will know of its temples, its codes, and its ruler. And that shared awareness is itself a kind of unification, one that may endure even if the precise shape of the state changes. If Nara represents the height of formality and the dream of a perfectly ordered realm, what will happen when the seat of power shifts and court life begins to turn inward toward beauty, art, and ceremony, rather than law and administration? Will the unity built here survive when elegance takes precedence over efficiency? If you watch the streets of Nara long enough, you will notice the movement of carts and officials slowing, then redirecting entirely. By the late 8th century, the capital is moved to Heian-kyo, modern Kyoto, a location chosen for both its strategic defensibility and its favorable alignment according to Chinese geomantic principles. At first, the move seems like another practical adjustment to central rule, but over time, Heian will become something different. It will be less about the strict application of law and more about the cultivation of refinement as the measure of authority. The court here still sits under the emperor, but the day-to-day administration increasingly rests in the hands of aristocratic families. Most famously, the Fujiwara, who perfect the art of influence through marriage, politics, and control of key offices. Power in Heian-kyo is a matter of proximity, not just physical closeness to the emperor, but cultural closeness to the ideals that define courtly life. Those ideals are intricate. A noble's standing can rise or fall based on the elegance of their handwriting, the subtlety of their poetry, or the appropriateness of their clothing to the season and occasion. The spoken word is carefully measured, and often replaced by written notes folded just so and scented with incense. This is a world where the perfection of form is seen as evidence of the perfection of mind and spirit. The bureaucracy continues to function, but it takes on a slower, more ceremonial rhythm. Reports still arrive from the provinces. Taxes are still collected, but these practical matters are often overshadowed by the rhythms of court events, seasonal festivals, and the endless composition of poetry. Decisions are made not with the speed of urgency, but with the deliberation of a painter layering ink on silk. For the common people beyond the capital, life is less transformed. Rice is still planted and harvested, fishing boats still put out before dawn, and the dangers of famine, flood, and disease remain constant. But the connection between the provinces and the court becomes more about symbolism than control. The emperor's name may be invoked in rituals, and his court's tastes may influence distant crafts. But the practical governance of far-off regions increasingly falls to local leaders, who are left to solve problems as they see fit. This decentralization is not necessarily intentional, but it is inevitable. As court life turns inward and measures its success in the subtleties of etiquette, rather than the firmness of administration, the ability to enforce the Richerio codes weakens. Provincial governors may pay lip service to the capital while pursuing their own priorities. Some become powerful enough to be courted rather than commanded. Yet the Heian court leaves a deep cultural legacy. Literature flourishes here in a way unmatched in earlier centuries. The tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, emerges not only as a masterpiece of prose, but as a detailed portrait of courtly life, its joys, intrigues, and quiet tragedies. Poetry becomes a universal art among the aristocracy, a way to communicate emotions and political intent alike. Religious life also evolves with the growth of new Buddhist sects that blend continental doctrines with local beliefs, creating practices that resonate beyond the court's reach. To stand in Heian-kyo at the height of this period is to be surrounded by color, texture, and sound. Silk robes in layers of subtle shades, the scent of blossoms drifting through open wooden halls, the murmur of music from a koto in the next room. But beneath this beauty is the slow erosion of centralized power. The court's elegance is real, but so is its distance from the realities of the countryside. The seeds of a new kind of power are taking root outside the capital, in the form of warriors who live far from Heian's polished halls and measure worth not in poetry, but in loyalty and strength. When those seeds grow, will the refined world of the court be able to withstand them, or will it find itself preserved only in memory and in the pages of literature? You probably picture samurai as these stoic, sword-wielding figures in lacquered armor, strolling through misty bamboo groves. And while that's a nice image, the actual birth of the samurai was far messier, and like most things in Japanese history, it began with politics, land disputes, and a healthy dose of warfare. Back in the late Heian period, roughly the 900s, 1100s, the imperial court in Kyoto was still technically in charge, but they were so wrapped up in poetry contests, moon-viewing parties, and calligraphy competitions that they didn't notice the countryside slipping out of their control. Landowners and aristocrats far from the capital needed muscle to protect their estates from bandits, rebellious farmers, and rival clans. That muscle came in the form of professional warriors, the samurai, meaning those who serve. Over time, the term evolved into samurai, and with it came the rise of a new social class. At first, samurai weren't the noble paragons you see in movies. They were essentially armed enforcers. They fought on horseback with bows and arrows, wore lamellar armor made from iron plates laced with silk, and prized skill in mounted archery above swordsmanship. But their loyalty was not to the emperor. It was to their clan leader or local lord, who could pay them and protect their family's position. Two major warrior clans began to dominate the political landscape: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both traced their lineage to imperial princes, but had shifted their power base to the provinces, where their control over samurai armies gave them real leverage. As the imperial court grew weaker, these clans began fighting not just for land, but for control of the government itself. The tipping point came in the late 12th century, with the Genpei War 1180-1185, a brutal civil conflict between the Taira and the Minamoto. It was a bloody struggle involving naval battles, sieges, and enough betrayal to fill a Shakespearean tragedy. In the end, the Minamoto, led by the brilliant and occasionally ruthless Minamoto no Yoritomo, emerged victorious. In 1192, Yoritomo received the title Seiitai Shogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, from the emperor. This was not just an honorific. It was a job description that effectively made him the military ruler of Japan. The emperor remained on the throne, but the real power now rested in the hands of the shogun, headquartered in Kamakura. This marked the beginning of Japan's first shogunate, or military government, known as the Kamakura Bakufu. Under this new system, the samurai were no longer just bodyguards or hired swords. They became the backbone of the state. Land was granted to warriors in exchange for military service, creating a feudal-like network of obligations and loyalties. Laws were written with warriors in mind, emphasizing discipline, obedience, and readiness for battle. This was the dawn of a Japan ruled not by courtiers with ink brushes, but by armored men with swords and bows, a shift that would shape the nation for the next 700 years. Imagine you are living in Japan sometime during the late Heian period, roughly between the years 900 and 1100. The imperial court in Kyoto, the capital city, is a place of breathtaking beauty and refined culture. Noblemen and women gather to write poetry about the changing seasons, to compose music, and to indulge in elaborate ceremonies. The emperor's throne is more a symbol than a seat of power. The court is preoccupied with elegance and art, but far away, in the countryside, things are very different. You travel beyond the delicate gardens of Heian-kyo and find yourself in a world shaped less by artful calligraphy and more by the rough hands of those who work the land and protect it. Here, powerful landowners control large estates called shoen, which are often exempt from imperial taxation. These landholders are not the refined courtiers but pragmatic figures who care deeply about the security and productivity of their domains. Yet, the countryside is not always peaceful. Bandits, rebellious farmers, and rival clans threaten to disrupt the fragile order. To guard their lands, the aristocrats hire armed retainers, men skilled in the arts of war. These warriors are called samurai, meaning those who serve. And over time, this term evolves into the word samurai that we recognize today. At first, these samurai are little more than hired muscle, mounted archers riding across fields to protect crops and enforce their lord's will. They wear armor made from small iron plates, laced together with colorful silk cords, and carry the long yumi bow, prized for its power and accuracy, especially from horseback. This emerging warrior class is tied not to the emperor, but to their local lord, a patron who provides them with land or stipends in exchange for military service. Their loyalty is personal and often familial, rooted in bonds of mutual benefit rather than abstract allegiance to a distant throne. Among the many clans jockeying for influence, two rise above the rest: the Taira and the Minamoto. Both boast descent from imperial princes, yet both have moved their power bases from the capital to the provinces. The Taira clan, more established and wealthy, controls extensive lands and has a strong presence in western Japan. The Minamoto, though historically smaller, are known for their military skill and strategic acumen. The rivalry between these two clans is not merely a family feud. It is a struggle for the future of Japan itself. The imperial court, distracted by its own rituals and rivalries, increasingly loses control over the outlying provinces, which become battlegrounds for the ambitions of these warrior families. The tension explodes into full-scale civil war in the year 1180, the beginning of the Genpei War. This conflict lasts 5 brutal years and is marked by a series of battles both on land and at sea. The warriors fight with an intensity born of loyalty, honor, and the desire for survival. One of the most famous episodes of this war is the Battle of Dan no Yura, fought in 1185, a naval battle in the narrow strait between Honshu and Kyushu Islands. The waters churn with warships bearing samurai clad in armor, their banners snapping in the wind. The battle is fierce and chaotic. The Minamoto forces, led by Minamoto no Yoshitsune, ultimately gain the upper hand. The Taira clan suffers a devastating defeat. The young emperor, supported by the Taira, drowns in the sea, an act that signals the end of their political power. With the Taira defeated, Minamoto no Yoritomo consolidates power. In 1192, he is appointed Seitai Shogun, meaning barbarian subduing generalissimo, a title originally used for commanders suppressing indigenous tribes in northern Japan, but now transformed into a symbol of military supremacy. Yoritomo establishes his headquarters in Kamakura, far from the traditional imperial capital, signifying the shift of real political power from the court to the samurai. This moment marks the birth of the Kamakura Bakufu or Shogunate, Japan's first warrior government. The emperor remains the nominal ruler, revered as a divine figure descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. But the shogun wields the practical authority. The shogunate functions as a military dictatorship, backed by a network of loyal samurai vassals who manage land, dispense justice, and maintain order. The rise of the samurai class and the warrior government changes the very fabric of Japanese society. Under the Kamakura shogunate, land becomes the currency of power. The shogun grants estates to his loyal warriors, who in return owe military service and political support. This system creates a feudal web of obligations where power is negotiated and reinforced through personal bonds and martial loyalty rather than distant imperial decree. The samurai's daily life is defined by discipline and readiness. Training in archery, swordsmanship, horseback riding, and strategy consumes much of their time. But they are also bound by a code of conduct that would evolve over centuries into Bushido, or the way of the warrior. This code emphasizes loyalty, honor, courage, and self-sacrifice. Though the precise rules vary over time and place, the ideal samurai embodies a balance of martial skill, ethical behavior, and calm self-control. Yet samurai life is not a constant whirlwind of battle. Much of their time is spent managing estates, overseeing agriculture, and maintaining alliances. Their families are deeply involved in local governance and cultural activities. Though often seen as warriors, many samurai are also patrons of literature, calligraphy, and Buddhist practice. The Kamakura period also witnesses significant religious developments among samurai circles. New Buddhist sects like Zen gain popularity, emphasizing meditation, simplicity, and direct experience over ritual. Zen's focus on discipline and self-mastery resonates with the samurai ethos, influencing both their spiritual life and martial practice. The establishment of the shogunate brings new administrative structures as well. The Jito are appointed as estate stewards to collect taxes and maintain order. The Shugo serve as military governors overseeing provinces, ensuring the shogunate's control extends beyond Kamakura itself. Courts of law are created to handle disputes between samurai, landholders, and peasants. Despite its military nature, the Kamakura government balances force with law and ceremony. The shogunate recognizes the importance of maintaining legitimacy by upholding traditional imperial authority symbolically, even as it exercises real power. This duality shapes much of Japanese history in the centuries to come, a subtle dance between the visible throne and the hidden sword. However, the shift to a warrior-led government is not without challenges. The aristocratic court in Kyoto continues to exist and occasionally exerts influence, and the regional lords' loyalties can be fragile. Japan remains a land of geographic fragmentation. Mountains, rivers, and seas complicate communication and control. The shogunate must constantly negotiate power with local leaders, samurai families, and religious institutions. Still, the rise of the samurai and the Kamakura shogunate heralds a new era. It marks the beginning of nearly 700 years during which warrior governments shaped Japan's political, cultural, and social life. The samurai become not only the country's military backbone but also cultural icons embodying values that still resonate in Japan today. As you imagine the world shifting from courtly poetry to armored warriors riding across dusty roads, consider this. How did the ideals of loyalty and honor born in these turbulent times survive centuries of peace, war, and transformation? And how did the samurai's rise redefine what it meant to govern and to serve in Japan? By the late 13th century, the Kamakura shogunate had firmly established the samurai as the ruling military class of Japan. The web of feudal obligations stretched across the islands, and the samurai had transformed from local enforcers to the nation's governing backbone. But soon, a force unlike any they had faced would challenge the very survival of this new order, the Mongol Empire. The Mongols had been building their empire under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, with breathtaking speed and ruthless efficiency. By the time Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, sat on the throne of the Yuan dynasty in China, the Mongol armies controlled vast swaths of Asia and sought to expand their influence eastward. The islands of Japan, just across the sea, caught their imperial gaze. In 1994, I mean the year 1274, Kublai Khan sent envoys to Japan demanding submission. These envoys brought a message: recognize Mongol suzerainty, pay tribute, and accept Mongol overlordship. The Kamakura shogunate, confident in its samurai warriors and fiercely proud of Japan's independence, refused. The stage was set for confrontation. The first Mongol invasion arrived in the late summer of 1274. A fleet of hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers crossed the Korea Strait, landing on Tsushima and Iki Islands, before pushing towards Kyushu, Japan's southernmost main island. The samurai defenders met the invaders with the ferocity and discipline honed through decades of conflict. But the Mongol armies brought new tactics and technologies unfamiliar to the samurai. Unlike the samurai, who prized individual combat and valor, the Mongols excelled in coordinated group tactics, archery volleys, and psychological warfare. They used gunpowder weapons like primitive bombs and explosive arrows, catching the samurai off guard. Despite fierce resistance, the samurai were forced to retreat, and the Mongols began establishing footholds. However, their occupation was short-lived. Just as the Mongols prepared to consolidate their gains, a violent typhoon struck the region. The storm wrecked much of the Mongol fleet, drowning thousands of soldiers and scattering ships. The Japanese later called this divine intervention the Kamikaze, the divine wind, believing the gods had sent a storm to protect their land. The Mongols retreated, licking their wounds but far from defeated. 15 years later, in 1281, a second, even larger invasion force assembled. This time, the Mongols had learned from their mistakes. The fleet was bigger, better armed, and more carefully planned. The target again was Kyushu, and the samurai prepared for the onslaught. The battles that followed were some of the fiercest Japan had ever seen. The Mongols employed new siege weapons, massed infantry assaults, and coordinated naval attacks. The samurai, fighting not only for land but for their very way of life, stood firm behind hastily constructed defensive walls. Many fought with desperate courage, while others died tragically in hand-to-hand combat. Once more, nature played a decisive role. A second typhoon struck, devastating the Mongol fleet and forcing a retreat that ended the threat for good. The Kamikaze had saved Japan twice, but the victory came at a cost. The samurai and the shogunate had poured vast resources into defense. Lands were devastated, trade disrupted, and many warriors left unpaid, fueling discontent. The shogunate's authority began to weaken as it struggled to reward its loyal samurai and maintain order. The rigid feudal system, so effective in war, showed signs of strain during peace. The Mongol invasions left an indelible mark on Japanese society and samurai culture. The threat of foreign conquest reinforced the importance of military preparedness, discipline, and loyalty. The samurai code hardened into a more formalized ethos, emphasizing readiness to defend the homeland at all costs. The sense of Japan as a distinct, divinely protected realm took deeper root. Yet questions remained. Could a government built on feudal loyalties survive prolonged peace? Would the samurai maintain their honor and cohesion without a clear external enemy? And how would Japan adapt as new ideas and technologies from abroad continued to trickle in through trade and contact? These questions would shape the centuries to come, as Japan balanced the traditions of the samurai with the changing tides of history. If you stood in Japan in the early 14th century, you would see a land at a crossroads. The Kamakura shogunate, Japan's first warrior government, had held power for over a century, but the strains caused by costly wars, internal rivalries, and economic hardship were beginning to show. The samurai class remained powerful, but was no longer united under a single authority. Instead, Japan was slipping into a period of decentralization and conflict that would reshape its history for centuries. The downfall of Kamakura began quietly. The shogunate's inability to adequately reward its warriors after the Mongol invasions led to growing dissatisfaction among key samurai families. Many samurai, having fought valiantly, found themselves landless or in debt, fueling unrest. The imperial court in Kyoto, though weakened, saw an opportunity to regain power by playing factions against each other. In the year 1303, Emperor Go-Daigo launched a rebellion aimed at overthrowing the Kamakura shogunate and restoring imperial rule. This movement, known as the Meiji Restoration, briefly succeeded in dismantling the shogunate in 1333. However, the restoration was short-lived. Emperor Go-Daigo's attempts to centralize authority alienated many samurai, who were accustomed to autonomy and reward based on loyalty to military leaders rather than distant emperors. Enter Ashikaga Takauji, a powerful general initially loyal to the emperor but who soon turned against him. Takauji seized Kyoto and declared himself shogun in 1338, founding the Ashikaga shogunate, also called the Muromachi Bakufu, after the district in Kyoto, where the government was based. Unlike the Kamakura shogunate, which ruled from Kamakura far from the capital, the Ashikaga shogunate re-established itself close to the traditional seat of imperial power, blending courtly culture with military governance. However, this new regime lacked the absolute control that Kamakura once held. Power became fragmented among regional daimyo, or warlords, who wielded significant autonomy over their territories. The Ashikaga period is often described as one of both cultural flourishing and political instability. Kyoto became a vibrant center of arts, including No theater, ink painting, and the tea ceremony, reflecting a sophisticated aristocratic culture. Yet, Beneath this surface of refinement, the country was plagued by frequent conflicts known as the Onin War and the subsequent Sengoku period, or Warring States era. The Onin War, which began in 1467, was a devastating civil war that marked the beginning of the Sengoku period. It arose from succession disputes within the Ashikaga family and escalated into widespread fighting among rival clans. Kyoto itself was ravaged, with temples and palaces burned, leaving the capital a shadow of its former glory. During this time, the authority of the shogun was nominal at best. The real power rested in the hands of powerful daimyo who controlled their own armies and lands. These warlords fortified castles, recruited samurai, and constantly jostled for territory and influence. Japan resembled a patchwork of competing states rather than a unified nation. The samurai class adapted to this new reality. The ideal of loyalty to a single lord remained, but many warriors shifted allegiance depending on opportunity or survival. The development of new weapons, such as firearms introduced by Portuguese traders in the 16th century, further altered the nature of warfare and power dynamics. Despite the chaos, the Ashikaga period laid important foundations for later unification. The culture of the warrior elite blended with refined court traditions, producing enduring art forms and philosophies. The concept of Bushido continued to evolve, emphasizing loyalty, discipline, and honor, even amid shifting alliances. Moreover, the constant warfare prompted innovations in administration, agriculture, and economics. Daimyo built infrastructure to support their armies and domains, fostering local economies and trade networks. Castles became centers not only of military strength but of governance and culture. By the late 16th century, figures like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu began the long process of reunifying Japan, bringing an end to the Sengoku period and ushering in a new era of peace under the Tokugawa shogunate. Yet, as you stand at this juncture in history, surrounded by the ruins of war-torn Kyoto and the shifting loyalties of samurai clans, you might wonder, how could a nation torn apart by conflict produce such rich culture and innovation? What does this paradox tell us about the resilience and adaptability of human societies? In the wake of the Sengoku period's chaos, Japan stood fractured, exhausted by decades of near-constant warfare. Amid this turmoil, a new leader emerged, Tokugawa Ieyasu, whose vision and strategy would bring unprecedented peace and order to the islands. By the early 17th century, Ieyasu had unified the country and established the Tokugawa shogunate, a military government that would rule Japan for over 250 years. Imagine yourself in Edo, modern-day Tokyo, the new seat of power, far from the old capitals of Kyoto and Kamakura. Edo was a modest fishing village when Ieyasu took control, but it quickly grew into a sprawling city, the political and administrative heart of Tokugawa Japan. Here, the shogun ruled not with brute force alone, but through a complex system of social hierarchy, regulation, and cultural control. The Tokugawa period is often called the Edo period, named after the city, and it's characterized by remarkable stability. The samurai, once warriors engaged in near-constant combat, now became bureaucrats, administrators, and symbols of order. Their swords remained at their sides as marks of status and honor, but few drew them in battle during these peaceful centuries. This peace was not accidental. Tokugawa Ieyasu and his successors carefully crafted a political structure designed to prevent the resurgence of civil war. They imposed strict rules on the powerful daimyo, requiring them to maintain residences in Edo and spend alternate years there, a system called Sankin Kotai. This not only kept lords under close watch, but also drained their resources, limiting their ability to rebel. Social classes were rigidly defined. Samurai at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and merchants. Movement between classes was rare, and each group had specific roles and expectations. The emphasis on order extended to every aspect of life, from dress codes to festivals, all designed to reinforce stability and harmony. Under this system, agriculture flourished. Land was carefully managed, irrigation improved, and rice production increased to support the growing population. Roads were maintained to facilitate trade and communication. Markets and towns expanded, fostering a vibrant economy that connected even remote villages to urban centers. Culturally, the Edo period was a golden age. With peace came the leisure to develop arts and entertainment. Kabuki theater, ukiyo-e woodblock prints, haiku poetry, and tea ceremonies flourished, reflecting both the refined tastes of the elite and the vibrant life of the common people. The samurai embraced Confucian ideals emphasizing duty, loyalty, and self-discipline, which further legitimized their role as society's moral and administrative leaders. However, Tokugawa Japan was also notably isolationist. The shogunate limited foreign contact through policies known as sakoku, effectively closing Japan off from much of the world. Foreign trade was restricted to a few carefully controlled ports, and Christianity was banned amid fears it might undermine social order. This inward turn preserved Japanese culture, but also limited technological and scientific exchange. Despite the long peace, challenges simmered beneath the surface. Economic growth led to increased wealth among merchants who lacked political power, causing subtle social tensions. Natural disasters, famines, and peasant uprisings occasionally tested the shogunate's control. And by the 19th century, external pressures from Western powers demanding trade access would shake the foundations of Tokugawa rule. The Tokugawa shogunate's ability to maintain peace and order for centuries, transforming a land of warring states into a unified and culturally rich nation, remains a remarkable feat of governance. The era shaped Japan's identity, social structures, and artistic heritage in ways that still resonate today. As you imagine the streets of Edo bustling with merchants, samurai officials, artists, and common folk, you might ask, how did a government built on military conquest adapt to govern through laws, rituals, and cultural norms? What lessons about power and peace can we draw from this long chapter in Japan's history? For over 2 centuries, Japan's Tokugawa shogunate had kept the nation carefully insulated from much of the outside world. This policy of sakoku, or national isolation, limited foreign contact to a trickle. Dutch and Chinese traders were confined to a small artificial island in Nagasaki harbor. Christianity was outlawed, and Japanese were forbidden to leave the country. But the mid-19th century would bring winds of change, carried on the sails of powerful Western navies and steamships. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his black ships in the year 1853 marked the beginning of the end for Japan's centuries-long seclusion. Perry's fleet, armed with the latest technology and imposing weaponry, steamed into Edo Bay with demands: open your ports for trade and diplomatic relations, or face military consequences. This show of force shocked a Japan unaccustomed to such direct confrontation. Behind the scenes, debates raged among the shogunate's leaders. Some argued for cautious accommodation, others for resistance. The country faced a dilemma: preserve its isolation and risk war with a vastly superior military power, or open its doors and risk social upheaval and foreign influence. Ultimately, the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, granting limited trade rights to the United States. Soon after, similar treaties followed with Britain, Russia, and other powers, marking Japan's reluctant entry into global diplomacy and commerce. The consequences were profound and swift. Foreign goods flooded markets, new ideas spread, and Japan's traditional social order began to strain under the pressures of modernization and westernization. The samurai class, once the unquestioned ruling elite, found its status challenged as merchants and bureaucrats gained influence. The period known as the Bakumatsu, the end of the shogunate, saw increasing unrest, political intrigue, and calls to restore imperial rule. Powerful domains like Satsuma and Choshu spearheaded movements to overthrow the Tokugawa and modernize Japan. By 1868, the Meiji Restoration restored the emperor to direct political power, ending the shogunate's centuries-long rule. Japan embarked on a rapid and dramatic transformation from a feudal society into a modern nation-state, eager to stand equal among the world's powers. But this transition was neither smooth nor painless. It involved internal conflicts, the dissolution of the samurai class, and fierce debates about identity, tradition, and progress. Japan's encounter with the West forced it to rethink everything from governance to technology, culture to military strategy. As you consider this turbulent era, you might wonder, how did a nation so long isolated adapt so rapidly to the modern world? What compromises were made, and what was lost in the rush to embrace the future? The year is 1868. The ancient capital of Kyoto awakens to a dawn unlike any other. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 250 years, has just collapsed. Power has been restored to the emperor, a figure who for centuries had been little more than a spiritual symbol. This moment marks the beginning of the Meiji era, a time of profound transformation, ambition, and challenge for Japan. Imagine the streets of Tokyo, newly renamed from Edo, buzzing with energy and uncertainty. The leaders of the new government are determined to propel Japan into the ranks of modern industrial nations. They look westward to Europe and America for models of technology, governance, and military power. But this rapid modernization must be balanced with the preservation of Japan's identity and culture. The Meiji government embarks on a sweeping program of reforms. Feudal domains are abolished, replaced by a centralized prefectural system. The samurai class is dissolved, their stipends ended, and their privileges revoked. Many samurai, once the nation's warrior elite, are forced to find new roles as bureaucrats, businessmen, or farmers. This social upheaval causes unrest and even rebellion, but the government's resolve is firm. Education becomes a national priority. Western science, engineering, and medicine are introduced, and compulsory schooling spreads across the country. Railways, telegraph lines, and factories sprout, linking distant regions and fueling economic growth. The military is modernized with conscription and new technologies, creating an army and navy modeled after Western powers. Diplomatically, Japan seeks to renegotiate the unequal treaties imposed during the Bakumatsu, striving to regain full sovereignty. Militarily and economically, it aims to defend itself from imperial ambitions by Western powers and its powerful neighbors. This period also sees cultural shifts. Traditional arts adapt to new tastes, and new literary forms emerge. The tension between modernity and tradition is palpable, with debates about how much to embrace the West and what to retain from Japan's past. By the end of the Meiji era, in 1914, Japan has transformed itself dramatically, emerging as a regional power capable of challenging even Western nations. Yet questions linger. At what cost did this rapid modernization come? How did ordinary people experience these profound changes? And how did the echoes of samurai honor and identity survive in a society racing toward industrialization? By the early 20th century, Japan had emerged from the shadows of isolation into the bright, unforgiving light of global politics. The Meiji era's dramatic reforms had laid the groundwork for a nation eager to assert itself beyond its shores. Now, the question was, could this newly modernized Japan compete with the great powers of the world? The answer came quickly and violently. Japan's first major test was the First Sino-Japanese War of 1914 to 1905. The conflict erupted over control of Korea, a strategically vital peninsula long under Chinese influence. Japan, armed with a modern navy, an army modeled on Western lines, struck with surprising speed and efficiency. The war revealed the weaknesses of the Qing dynasty, but showcased Japan's military prowess. The Japanese Navy won decisive victories in battles like the Battle of the Yellow Sea, while on land, troops pushed into Manchuria, securing key territories. The Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, ended the war with Japan gaining Taiwan, influence over Korea, and recognition as a regional power. But victory bred ambition. Japan's imperial dreams grew, fueled by a desire for resources, security, and respect among nations. The next major conflict, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, pitted Japan against a European empire for influence in Manchuria and Korea. This war was a pivotal moment not only for Japan but for the entire world. It was the first time an Asian power decisively defeated a European empire in modern warfare, shattering long-held assumptions about racial and military superiority. The siege of Port Arthur and the Battle of Tsushima Strait became legendary, demonstrating Japan's strategic and tactical skill. Japan's victory enhanced its status, but also set the stage for further expansionist policies. Korea was formally annexed in 1910, leading to decades of harsh colonial rule. Japan's presence in Manchuria expanded, culminating in the establishment of the puppet state Manchukuo in the early 1930s. These imperial ambitions came with consequences. Domestically, the military's influence in politics increased, often overshadowing civilian government. Internationally, Japan's aggressive moves stirred tensions with other powers, particularly the United States and China. At the same time, Japan experienced rapid industrialization and urban growth, with cities like Tokyo and Osaka expanding their populations and industries. The social fabric changed as people moved from rural areas to factories, and new ideas, nationalism, socialism, and democracy, circulated in newspapers and universities. Through all this, ordinary lives were shaped by forces often beyond their control: conscription, economic upheaval, and the spectre of war. The samurai legacy of loyalty and martial valor was invoked to support national unity and military service, even as the old warrior class had long since vanished. As you picture this era of rising empires and clashing ambitions, consider, how did Japan's transformation from a feudal society to a modern power influence its choices on the world stage? And what lessons might history hold about the costs of empire and the complexities of national identity? By the early 20th century, Japan's rise as a modern imperial power was undeniable, yet this ascent carried with it shadows that would plunge the nation into conflict and profound transformation. The decades that followed would see Japan embroiled in global war, devastated by defeat, and ultimately reborn from the ashes of destruction. The path toward turmoil accelerated in the 1930s. Japan's military, increasingly autonomous and influential within the government, pursued aggressive expansion in East Asia. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 marked a blatant defiance of international law and set a precedent for further incursions into China. The brutal occupation that followed deepened Japan's involvement in a sprawling conflict that would soon merge with the wider Second World War. Japan's alliance with Axis powers Germany and Italy led to war with the Allied nations. From 1941 onward, the Pacific theater became the site of fierce battles across islands and seas. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 shocked the world and drew the United States fully into the conflict. Japanese soldiers and sailors fought with determination, often facing overwhelming odds. The war strained the country's resources and inflicted suffering on millions. The samurai ideal of honor and sacrifice was frequently invoked to inspire soldiers, even as the brutal realities of modern mechanized warfare bombings, starvation, and civilian casualties contrasted sharply with the romanticized warrior past. As the war turned against Japan, devastating air raids and the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought unimaginable destruction. The Emperor's radio address announcing surrender marked the end of a catastrophic era and the beginning of occupation and reconstruction under Allied supervision. Japan faced the daunting task of rebuilding a shattered nation. The post-war years brought sweeping reforms. A new constitution renounced war, established democratic governance, and guaranteed civil rights. Economic recovery was rapid, but required profound shifts in society and industry. The country's identity underwent transformation as well. The samurai spirit was reinterpreted, not as a call to arms, but as a cultural and ethical legacy, emphasizing discipline, perseverance, and honor in everyday life. Traditional arts and values found new relevance in a modern democratic society. Japan's post-war economic miracle propelled it to global prominence, but beneath the surface lay questions about how a nation so thoroughly transformed could reconcile its past with its present. How did ordinary Japanese people navigate the tensions between tradition and modernity? And what does the story of war and rebirth teach us about resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity? Standing in present-day Japan, you witness a nation both steeped in ancient tradition and blazing toward the future. From the neon-lit streets of Tokyo to serene temples in Kyoto, the echoes of samurai swords and imperial courts mingle with cutting-edge technology and global culture. Japan's story is one of resilience, shaped by cycles of war and peace, isolation and openness, rigid hierarchy and dynamic change. The legacies of samurai honor, Shinto spirituality, and Zen discipline continue to influence everything from business practices to pop culture. Modern Japan is a blend of contradictions and harmonies. Its economy ranks among the world's largest, driven by innovation and global trade. Yet demographic challenges, like an aging population, pose complex questions about social support and growth. The cultural emphasis on community, respect, and perseverance sustains social cohesion amid rapid change. In politics and diplomacy, Japan balances its pacifist constitution with security concerns in a shifting regional landscape. Efforts to preserve cultural heritage go hand in hand with embracing diversity and new ideas. As you walk through Japan's layered history, consider how the experiences of ordinary people, farmers, artisans, merchants, warriors, have woven the fabric of a nation. How will Japan's past guide its future? And what might the next chapters of this long, intricate story look like?